importer or exporter accounts. And it's really critical that if they don't have one, that they get one, because that's like I think one of the number one tools that a compliant company can use to monitor its imports and exports and discover any issue areas that need correcting.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
And welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Happy New Year again. This is part 2 or episode 2 of the 2023 kickoff show with Adrienne Braumiller and George Tuttle. Just as a quick reminder for everyone where we left off, we did leave off on a discussion on part 111. This is a new regulation, but we are picking up here again on that. Thank you all and enjoy.
And I guess the next question is, Andy, has this been enforced, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, you talking about as far as the 111 type scenarios?
As far as performing customs business in the U.S.
Oh, yes. Okay.
And I haven't really seen a whole lot on that, but I think it's coming.
See, I wouldn't doubt that. I just, that's a scenario where, as we're talking through, I always like to try and say, okay, based on this discussion for our listeners, what's your takeaway? And again, the takeaway, remember what we suggested is having a meeting. It needs to be a very strategic meeting talking about your complete supply chain. At some point, you're going to need to also pull in, your marketing efforts, your legal to say, if there's certain things that you get to a certain point and say, okay, now I have a legal review from that. And I'm not just a general from a contract, although that comes into play. But from
let me jump off on one more point. Let me jump off on one more point, because it's really what Adrienne brought up, but let's take it to a different level. Let's bring it right in to see how it impacts the importer, right? Yeah. And that's the concept of what is customs business versus what is a corporate compliance activity that's permissible versus customs business, where you have a compliance team that's run out of your corporate headquarters and they are providing advice to subsidiaries or providing trade services to compliance services to subsidiaries. Is that permitted? Where's the line crossed? There's all sorts of problems with that because, in customs business means helping somebody to prepare and file a customs entry, advise them on the classification, advise them on the ruling, the country of origin, the proper customs value. It can be responding to a CF-28. I was just doing that the other day for a parent company that needed help with a CF-28 for their subsidiary. I said, well, the law says, the broker regulations say that's customs business. You can't help them prepare it because that's providing customs business, right? Whereas a corporate compliance activity is kind of in the post-entry environment. So you can audit them, you can tell them, hey, you did this right, you did this wrong, but you can't tell them really, for next week, this is how you have to classify your imported merchandise. That crosses the line.
Right.
How many people?
I got to say, though, to a point, I think things are getting to in this scenario here where, look, wait a minute, we're getting so bogged down in the bureaucratic things of this that it's like, wait a minute, what's the overall intent? You want that company, that function, that department to cross the T's, dot the I's, do it effectively. And then if we get hung up on, well, who can say it and who can't, it's like, are you kidding me? I've got to run a business here.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is the fact that I mean, you can always act. Every company can act on its own behalf, so that custom business can be performed on its own behalf. So, but it gets into, can you perform it on behalf of another entity? That's another legal
related or not.
Yeah, and that's when we get into these issues.
Right? Well, all right. So here, let's play that out, because I think that is a great point. But let's just say, okay, I've got a widget. My sourcing department is out there, and they found a manufacturer. Let's just say it's in Vietnam for sake here, and whatever the widget is, it's pretty simple. Nothing, no FDA or extra licensing or anything like it. Just a plain widget that comes in. It'll be classified and all that. Generally speaking, purchasing folks will find that source for whatever the widget. Marketing's out, marketing the thing, sales is driving up orders. Customer service starts taking those orders. They start getting into the pipeline. As it goes through, the compliance folks a lot of times are on the tail end of this thing. And so they're like, they don't even know it's coming in. So it's like unfortunate. They go in, they try and look at it, classify it real quickly. But then for the future, you look at it and go, okay, the purchase order was issued on this. You told the vendor what to ship, where to ship it, when to ship it, and what to put on that paperwork so they get paid. But one of the key things from a compliance, this is the disconnect. So here's where I'm saying is, like, if purchasing's in sync with the compliance, is that you didn't put the classification on there. You didn't put the proper country. This is how we want you to classify. This is the harmonized tariff number that we want you to use. Question I've got. If you put that on the purchase order up front and say all that, is here you go. Initially, that would be considered, I assume, customs business, because I'm giving you the classification. Or here's the after effect. It was not on the original purchase order. Now I'm going to instruct my vendor, I want this classified using this harmonized tariff number, and that needs to be on the paperwork.
There's a lot packed into that, Adrienne.
So the way I'm looking at it is, if you are instructing the supplier, because you've done the classification and you've identified all of the key compliance issues around what's going to be put in the entry, I think that's okay, because you're driving your own import and the compliance of your own import. What wouldn't be okay, let me change your facts, is if you were an importer. Let me think. I'm trying to remember this. Let's see. Example.
I got one for you. How about this?
Okay, you do it. Okay.
I'm a big corporation. I have lots of retail stores. Mm-hmm. I'm going to source from a U.S. perspective. So when I'm buying the goods, I'm buying it. Vendor.
Oh, that you just brought up a whole new set of problems.
you source it wherever you want, but here we go. Here's what I've seen. You source it wherever you want, but now when it comes in, I want you to classify it this way. I want you to do something, but yet the importer of record is the vendor, not the retail establishment, not the big store. That, I think, has crossed the line.
Yeah. I know.
Well,
I know, like that latest ruling, George.
Hampton. The Hampton ruling.
Yeah, where they're telling their customers how to classify.
Well, they didn't tell them how to classify. The customer said
it right.
It was how do you classify it? And Hampton said, we suggest
That's it. Thank you.
Suggest you could use this classification.
Right.
And Hampton asked whether it was permissible to do that. And Customs said, no, they kind of wiffle-waffled on it, but they basically said, no, you can't do that. Even if you use a disclaimer, is that going to go on? There's a couple of things that are associated with that, because first of all, if the importer's customs broker is looking, this is what Customs did say. If the importer's customs broker is looking at that tariff classification and signing off on it, saying, yeah, we looked at this, we think this is the correct tariff classification, then it's permissible, right? So,
Right. That's true.
there's
Okay.
some complexities to that. And I don't want to, I mean, the whole DDP importation using a non-resident importer, which is the issue that Andy brought up, has so many different complexities to it,
Right.
along with imports under section, 321 and the
Right.
800 value.
Mm-hmm.
Those are many more issues that are going to be affecting us and impacting us in 2023
Right.
that we would spend a whole nother hour talking about.
Well, let me hang on a second.
it-
There's one element though that I have seen happen many, many, many times, and that is it wasn't a DDP transaction. It was what was happening is the big box store, I'll say it that way.
Yeah.
Was buying their goods from their vendors.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want 1,000 widgets.
Sure.
And whatever. It's like, okay, fine. I'm buying from you as a domestic transaction. How you get it, where you get it, it's up to you. That's fine. But then as things progressed, they were like, hey, we've got a little bit of a delay in our manufacturing because of transportation and because of this or whatever. And they started revealing that, well, this is manufactured in XYZ country. And now all of a sudden the box store started saying, well, hey, we want to make sure that you're classifying it a certain way or doing something. And it's like, wait a minute, you're not even part of the international transaction. But since they're the big 800-pound gorilla.
They are the one that's facing the outward flack. If something goes wrong. So, for example, I just have an issue come up. We're a big box store, just the example, and I won't say who they are, but they told the supplier, you need to get a country of origin ruling from U.S. Customs before we'll approve this purchase agreement, because we want to make sure that Customs agrees that it's not subject to anti-dumping duty, it's not subject to 301 duties, all of these different things. So the box store is trying to be, trying to implement.
They're trying to do their corporate compliance, right? Yeah, they're trying to exercise due diligence.
They're driving the bus. Yeah.
Okay.
That's what they're trying to do. And the same thing with tariff classification, right? So they're not necessarily there because they're worried about perhaps a situation where their supplier is going to use the wrong tariff classification. Right. And that's been an issue in the past. I know there's been some nefarious things, as we could talk about, with regard to non-resident importers and kind of fraud in the import process using DDP. But I think that's what's behind it. So I think asking for your supplier to get a ruling is not a bad thing.
It's not. It's a great idea.
Yeah.
All right. So that's again from a compliance perspective. Actually, you bring up a good point, because you don't want to cross the line of trying to influence how your vendor is literally processing a transaction, with the exception being, hey, when it's delivered to me, I'm looking at that. It would be appropriate to say, hey, get a ruling on this. Let's make sure that this product, and like you just said, the country of origin, everything's going to be fine, because we don't want to get hit after the fact for some kind of anti-dumping case or something.
Let me bring up just one more thing, and I think Adrienne will like this one too. This gets back to our discussion of forced labor. Many of the big retail organizations, the Walmarts, the Costco's, the Lowe's, the Home Depots, if I can use their names for our sake of our example, are CTPAT participants.
Right.
And the CTPAT program has now rolled out some new requirements that every CTPAT company has to abide by, and that's implement a forced labor compliance program, including supply chain tracing. Right. So again, even if that big box store isn't necessarily the one that's doing the importing, they may interpret this as, and Customs may interpret this as a requirement that they have to validate that supply chain and make sure that there's no forced labor in the product production or in the assembly process or in any of the materials. It's very, very far reaching. And this is the issue that we're going to be dealing in 2023. And companies have to think about how they are going to implement that program.
Adrienne, any thoughts?
I mean, yeah, I think part of the issue with trying to do an entire tracing, which you need to try, right? You need to do what the best you can to trace the entire supply chain. Are the laws that China has in place that are contradictory to what we are doing, right? So they conflict,
Right.
And so I think all of this, the CTPAT requirement, the legal requirement of making sure there's no forced labor, it's a very difficult and complicated undertaking that will be frustrating and sometimes not effective. I mean, it has to be done. There's no way around it. It has to be done. It's just, how do we navigate the fact that there are these Chinese laws that prevent the supplier from actually complying with our request for an audit, for example.
So I think the way that works, I think the way that works is that's further decoupling from China.
Right.
Maybe you have to turn to Mexico for your supply chain.
Exactly.
And when you turn to your supply chain in Mexico, it's like, okay, now you have to tell me where you're sourcing this.
Mm-hmm.
And if they say, well, we're sourcing it from China, you have to say, no, you can't, because we can't explore that supply chain. You have to source your cotton from India. You have to, source your cotton from Egypt,
right.
And other regions in the world. You have to take command of it. When I started in this business back in the 70s, I know that doesn't seem that long ago, right? All the, we focused our business in the Silicon Valley area. Every computer chip, every computer company, every electronics company knew their supply chain. They knew where each piece, each material came from, because they were managing it. And slowly over the years, what happened is foreign companies grew up into conglomerates. They knew how to do things. And so we kind of lost that touch with our supply chain. We would just go out. You can go out on the internet and you can buy things that are made in foreign countries and have them shipped to the US using express carriers. It's door to door. It's seamless. You don't know anything about the background of that product. And that's the problem. And that's what we have to get back to. We have to get back to getting our hands on the source of that product, where it came from. Otherwise, we're going to run into problems when we try to import it, because we don't know if it's compliant or not.
Hey everyone, we're getting ready for another annual ICPA event coming up the week of March 12th in Orlando, Florida. If you have been thinking of attending any of the ICPA conferences, this is the one you should not miss. There will be more sessions than any other conference, with a guaranteed sellout, so hurry and get your tickets today. We are also excited to share that Simply Trade podcast will be in the attendance, and we want you to be part of our show. Listen to episodes 14, 15, and 16 to find out why you can't miss this conference.
All right, let me shift gears a little bit on this. Is that as you're talking about it, we need to know where that's at. The other part of it that we haven't really talked much about, and that is, again, the vetting process of your vendors, those kinds of things, but also your customers. Who are you doing business with? Who are you buying from? But also, who are you selling to? So in that realm, do you see in 2023 any type of enforcement activities on the government going in and trying to see, are you vetting appropriately, the denied party screening type things and restricted party screening and those kinds of things, especially with the Russia's sanctions and other things around the world?
I hope I'm really understanding your question, Andy, but I think, yes, that screening of the restricted parties list is critical to ensure compliance and avoiding massive penalties.
I don't. That's a hard question. There used to be a time when BIS and the Office of Export Enforcement had a very active regulatory auditing program, I'll say, where they would proactively go out and audit companies for internal controls and export compliance and things like that. We don't really see that the same way we see that in customs nowadays, right? With export enforcement and auditing, it's more the company triggers an audit by having a violation. Then regulatory audit, the Office of Export Enforcement will come in and do a compliance audit, and look to those factors about whether or not they're actively screening. No company is legally required to have a screening program.
No.
If you violate the regulations by doing business with a restricted party or a sanctioned party, and the government has very good investigation capabilities to determine if that's happening.
What I would say is, I think a lot of the activity around enforcement regarding those parties comes in the form of subpoenas. So a lot of it is investigative subpoenas, and we've had a lot of those this past year, quite a few. And many of the parties that are being investigated end up on the denied parties list. Mm-hmm. So there is enforcement around it, but it's not like, an exporter, hey, you did business with this party. Well, there certainly are those penalties, but to George's point, it's not so much that there's an audit there. It just comes up in other ways, and so if you don't have some kind of software in place, how do you know that you're doing business?
Right. Well, that's where I was going to go, is that I hadn't thought about it, George, but to your point, is it's a proactive move. There's not a requirement to do it, but I mean, if you violate that, then that's when that's the tip of the iceberg kind of thing. So it's more of a proactive thing. Lilo, you were going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, because of the sanctions that are obviously increasing more and more, there's more shell companies. We just heard that late in 2022, that you think you're doing business with someone that is not selling to Russians or whatever, and so, I mean, that point, I mean, it gets hard for the mom and pop, not that there's any mom and pop shops making high advanced lasers or anything, but
don't you see your mistake right there is thinking it has to be high-end lasers.
It doesn't have to be. You're right. Uh-huh.
It could doesn't. Be under the Russian sanctions. If we look at OFAC sanctions, it's doing business within the prohibited industry, oil and gas. It's doing business with oligarchs. It's buying high-end luxury goods. Don't just interpret export control nowadays as being high tech, because it's not. It's dealing with OFAC sanctions and sanctioned parties.
Well, it could be. It can be prohibited because of the end use. It can be prohibited because of the end user. It doesn't have to be even on the commerce control list. It can be an EAR 99 item and still have issues, right? Prohibiting it because of these.
All right, so here, let me throw this at you. What do you recommend as far as in this new year? What would be, from a leadership perspective, compliance is also going to be one of these questions that comes into play. But from an executive leadership type perspective, y'all's legal background and what you've seen, and basically being that proverbial pooper scooper at the end of the parade, cleaning up somebody else's mess, as you've gone in and with all that kinds of experience, what do you recommend for these leaders to I guess start off and do to help keep them out of trouble in 2023?
Can I start with this? Because that's a great question.
Yeah.
You need to listen to your supply chain team. You need to listen to your compliance team and
That's
ask
excellent.
them, what do we need to do?
Mm-hmm.
And listen to them. And then once they tell you, once they make some suggestions to you, give them the resources to implement it.
Right.
The two things. That's the simplest
I
thing
totally
that as a management executive you can do. You don't need to understand these rules.
No.
You need to trust the people that you've hired
right.
to understand these rules and let them do their job to protect your company.
Yeah, because I think the problem is a lot of times if the particular issue is one that means that there's a lot less business or revenue coming into the company, you may say, boy, that's unpopular, and I don't want to be the one that is involved in shutting down the business. But obviously, that's the point of compliance. That's why you have a compliance team, is to ensure that the company is not running afoul of the laws. And just because I think it's a situation of you have to be careful that the bottom line doesn't color decisions that need to be made to ensure compliance, right?
Agree. All right. So,
really
all right, here's one other then. Let's talk about the compliance folks. Is what would you recommend they do now before they get called upon to attend a meeting or whatever? What would you recommend the leader, manager, director of a compliance area of a company do in preparation for 2023?
I was going to let Adrienne go first.
Okay.
I've been grabbing the first
well,
one for a while.
I mean, honestly, and you mentioned it earlier, George, I think a risk assessment. I mean, if you haven't done any kind of risk assessment or review of the past year's entries, some kind of post-entry review or post-shipment if it's exports, that would be a good thing to do. And you can take the ACE data also and come up with a risk assessment, right? Hey, I didn't know we had items that are being imported now from China. I always thought everything came from Mexico. Where did that come from, right? I didn't know that we were claiming USMCA. I never said to do that, and I'm the compliance person. How did that happen? So definitely, I think a lot of really good compliance people do this as a routine course, but there are still a lot of companies out there that don't have ACE importer or exporter accounts, and it's really critical that if they don't have one, that they get one, because that's like I think one of the number one tools that a compliant company can use to monitor its imports and exports and discover any issue areas that need correcting.
Yeah, I think to kind of expand on that, I think many companies, not all companies, but many companies kind of offload their compliance function to their customs broker, thinking their customs broker is going to keep them out of trouble. And generally, the customs broker is viewing the relationship with the broker as one where I'm going to take this commercial invoice, this airway bill, this bill of lading. I'm going to take that information, not question it, and use it to complete the customs entry and file that entry electronically, not questioning the tariff classification, not questioning the value. So I think that for 2023, compliance people need to bring that compliance responsibility home, learn what their job is. I answer a lot of ICPA questions, and I got to tell you, I absolutely love it. It's I won't say this, but it's kind of fun for me to do it. I enjoy it. But what I notice is that a lot of people are asking questions in the ICPA that the answers are all found with a little bit of research, a little bit of, if I can say, Googling searches or something like that, being familiar with customs websites and the frequently asked questions, you can zero right into that answer. So I think compliance people need to take a little bit more time, learn about what resources are really available to them, to learn about what's out there and how they can better protect their company.
Well, especially becoming proficient with not only with what you're saying and being familiar, where it's not having it in memory going, oh yeah, this regulation's this, or this is, where it's knowing where to go to research and find the answer. And also, to Adrienne's point, you better have somebody proficient with your ACE account. You better get an ACE account if you don't already have one, and get proficient on that. And that's, well, actually, quite frankly, that's some of the stuff that, Lila, I'm, the training, the basic training, get your staff trained. And that's where obviously you come into play, to get your staff, the knowledge and the skills up to speed.
Right. And I was going to say also, I come from a technology background, as probably a lot of people already know, and I spent 25 years selling software for trade. And I know it hurts a lot, but don't you think that it's also a good time for people to review their software solution instead of sticking with what they have? I mean, it may not even be compliant, I don't mean compliant, but it might not be addressing their needs. I mean, I've seen it a lot in the past where a software solution, when we used to be called in and they realized that, I don't know, for whatever reason, something it doesn't calculate or do things correctly. And it hurts to change software solutions, but it'll benefit you.
You have to be careful. I've seen people take what was a software that was really built to help with export controls, try to alter it and bend it into something that would help with customs. And it never really did get there. And I know the company spent like $1 million on this. And I said to myself, why did you go to this software that's really great at exports and try to make it work for imports? So I think, you have to look at what are the bells and whistles that I need that will help me, but also understanding that even software can, every now and then, there can be some kind of gap in what the software does or the information it provides. So we have seen situations like with screening software where certain information didn't get in there in time before somebody consummated an order that they shouldn't have. So,
well, the funny thing about screening software, it's only good as what you set up the parameters, right?
Exactly.
If your screening software is only looking at Roman characters, or if it's not looking at Cyrillic, if it's not looking at Chinese characters and Chinese names and addresses, that's no good.
Right.
So you have to think about, I knew one company that every time they came across online purchase, a software purchase that was in, non-US characters, I'll say that, Arabic characters, they would just ignore it.
Right.
Okay. And that's a problem.
Well, listen, we can keep talking, and I know that we need to wrap up here. So it's, is there anything that normally we'll say, if you could talk to your 21-year-old self, what would you say? But let me throw it this way: is that
become a veterinarian?
There you go. Hey, buddy, it's like if I had it to do over, I'd be a rancher out somewhere and be a veterinarian myself. So,
right.
Any last key thing that you think would be an important thing to focus on for 2023?
I feel like we covered a lot of it.
Yeah, we sure did. It was like, you guys are phenomenal.
I feel like we covered major topics. We talked about.
We haven't talked about shipping yet, but
we haven't talked about shipping, but robust internal controls, country of origin, all the good things. We've talked about it. I can't think of anything else, but But you wanted to say something about shipping, George, or no?
No, that's a whole different topic. Although there's expected to be another shipping crunch coming up this year with China, so maybe booking your cargo is going to be a real big problem again, like we had before. That's the prediction. But I mean, if we were going to wrap things up again, I would think about, for the C-suite folks, you need to trust your compliance people. Ask them, what do they think we need to do, and what's the risk to us if we don't, so you can prioritize things, and then trust them to implement a program that will take care of that compliance risk, whatever it may be. And for the compliance people, I would say you need to be aware of what your key risks are, whether it's country of origin, whether it's anti-dumping and diversion, which gets back to country of origin, right? Whether it's Chinese sanctions, whether it's your supply chain, whether it's your export issues. Your job is to be knowledgeable and aware of how those things will impact your company.
And network within your company, because you can't do it on your own. You cannot. You got to be a team player. And
again, that comes down from the C-suite, right? When we talk about creating internal controls, you have to have somebody at the top that can tell your director of that can discuss with your director of purchasing, hey, we need to be aware of these compliance issues. You need to work with the compliance team. Don't shut them out.
Right.
Well, listen, Adrienne and George, you two, I love you to death. You're both so fantastic. You're just a pleasure to always be around. I always love to get to catch up with you. I know, Lalo, you're probably in the same boat, but thank you so much for a fantastic
thank you, Andy and Lalo and George.
Well, thank you all.
It was fun to do this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show, or would like to sponsor Simply Trade, or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only, and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.